The title of this lecture is The Renaissance. Now, the word Renaissance means literally rebirth. It involves a rebirth of ancient classical ideas, arts, and literature. By classical, we mean the ideas of ancient Greece and ancient Rome prior to Christianity. And it emerged in Italy. Now, why was that? Well, Italy was unique among Europe at the time in that classical civilization and culture were part of Italy's own ancient heritage. So it was natural for Italians to at some point want to recover their own history, their own heritage, their own ancient culture when the means for recovery presented themselves with the emergence of city life in Italy. Also, in the 14th and the 15th centuries, you have a lot of Greek scholars leaving Constantinople and settling in Italy. Now, why were they leaving? Well, in 1453, Constantinople fell to the Turks, and a lot of Greek intellectuals and scholars went into exile in the West. And they brought with them their knowledge of Greek and the ability to read Greek manuscripts. And the natural place that they settled for the most part was Italy, simply for geographical reasons. And this movement that was birthed in Italy spread very quickly to the rest of Europe. Now, the Renaissance was characterized by two things or two ideas: humanism and secularism. And we're going to discuss these in turn. Now, humanism, or particularly Renaissance humanism, is a name later given to the intellectual, literary, and artistic movements that emerged in the era. And in this era, again, is the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. It involved a recovery of classical styles in art, specifically realism and perspective, a decided turn away from scholastic philosophy to literary studies, involving, well, literature and rhetoric in particularly, and a return to ancient texts, particularly Greek and Latin texts in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Now, humanism is characterized by what's called philology, and philology literally means a love of language. The Renaissance humanists of the era were philologists, lovers of the word. They had a specialized knowledge of languages and ancient manuscripts, and they brought this love of not love of words, love of language to bear in their study of ancient texts. In addition, humanists were universal in their scorn for medieval scholastic philosophy. Now, why is that? Well, one of the reasons for this was the rise in the 14th century of nominalism. Now, prior to nominalism, medieval scholastic philosophy was characterized by what's known as realism, and this was philosophically the belief that words and ideas corresponded to actual realities, actual natures of things. Nominalism was a sharp departure from that idea and held that the names of things, ideas, were simply names or terms for things that exist in the mind and didn't necessarily correspond to objective realities. And so it led to a very, I don't want to say cynical, but a very skeptical view of philosophy, a very skeptical view of the idea that philosophical discourse and inquiry can lead us to the knowledge of the truth and of true real things. It also tended medieval scholastic philosophy to be very abstract and dry, focused upon technicalities of and finer details of logical analysis. And so it was separated or believed to be separated from concerns of daily life. And one of the things that the humanists were concerned with was practicality, the practical application of ideas to daily life, particularly life in the city, socio-political life. And also, Medieval scholastic philosophy ignored the historical and literary context of the text that the scholastics claimed to have mastered. It's one thing to look at Aristotle, for example, grammatically and logically, but the scholastic approach tended to ignore the historical, social context which gave rise to Aristotle's ideas. And the humanists wanted to recover these historical contexts for better understanding of the linguistic nature of Aristotle's ideas. And the same with Plato and Cicero and any other ancient authority. They didn't want to just go to the text as an abstract thing or an artifact, but to look at it philologically, again, within its linguistic historical context. And so, humanism involved a return to ancient texts, those of the pre-Christian era, such as Cicero, Plato, Virgil, Aristotle, and others, but also of the Christian era, a return to the Greek manuscripts of the Bible and the Church Fathers, both Greek and Latin. A representative of this movement, Pietro Paolo Vergerio, expressed it well when he wrote, "We call those studies liberal, which are worthy of a free man. Those studies by which we attain and practice virtue and wisdom, that education which calls forth, trains, and develops the highest gifts of the body and mind, which ennoble men, and which are rightly judged to rank next in dignity to virtue only." Now this quote, this sentiment, expresses perfectly the idea of Renaissance humanism and their approach to learning, their approach to what we call today the liberal arts, the freeing arts, those arts which not only develop the mind, but develop practicality in the application of ideas to daily life, the practice of virtue and wisdom. Notice the very practical approach that Vergerio takes to learning. It's not an abstract scholasticism, rather, it is a genuine humanism, a focus upon that which is authentically human and that which pertains to authentic, concrete human life. Now we turn to Francesco Petrarch. He's termed today as the father of humanism. He lived in the 14th century. He was trained as a lawyer, but then left the legal profession to pursue a career as a man of letters. Now, a man of letters is basically a modern term for one who is a philologist, a lover of the written word, one who loves to dive in and really swim in, take in to the full the richness of pieces of literature. Not a scholastic abstract philosopher at all. This is Francesco Petrarch, a man of letters. And we see this expressed in his work, Letters to the Ancient Dead. Now, these are personal letters addressed to ancient literary giants, such as Cicero, Livy, Virgil, and others. And Petrarch is writing to them as if they are his personal friends. And it shows the artfulness and the way in which Renaissance humanists relished language and ideas. He writes to Cicero in 1345. "Your letters I sought for long and diligently," and he means the letters of Cicero. He was looking forward to be able to study them as ancient texts. "And finally, where I least expected it, I found them. At once I read them over and over with the utmost eagerness. And as I read, I seemed to hear your bodily voice, O Marcus Tullius." Marcus Tullius is the name of Cicero. "Saying many things, uttering many lamentations, ranging through many phases of thought and feeling. I long had known how excellent a guide you have proved for others. At last I was to learn what sort of guidance you gave yourself. Now it is your turn to be the listener." Notice how he's addressing Cicero as if he's alive. "Hearken wherever you are to the words of advice, or rather of sorrow and regret, that fall, not unaccompanied by tears, from the lips of one of your successors," namely Petrarch himself, who loves you faithfully and cherishes your name. O spirit ever restless and perturbed in old age, I am but using your own words, self-involved in calamities and ruin. What good could you think would come of your incessant wrangling from all this wasteful strife and enmity? Where were the peace and quiet that befitted your years, your profession, and your station in life? Now, what he's referring to here is Cicero's own involvement in the attempt to stop the rise to power of Julius Caesar, which led eventually to Cicero's own death. He was doing this to defend the Roman Republic against the dictatorial tendencies of those who would become the emperors. And what Petrarch is saying here is, in your old age, Cicero, you should have retired to the quiet of doing philosophy, not get involved in political squabbles, which led to your downfall. Another Renaissance humanist, a very important one, is Lorenzo Valla, who lived a little bit after Petrarch, lived in the 15th century, both of whom were Italians. Now, Lorenzo Valla was an Italian scholar and a Latinist. He taught rhetoric at the University of Pavia, a very important university of the time that took its origins relatively recently in the period and was known for literary studies. Now, his Elegances of the Latin Language was the first textbook on Latin grammar to be written in nearly 1,000 years. Prior to this, the scholars were dependent upon the ancient authorities on Latin literature and grammar, such as Cicero and others. Lorenzo Valla produced what was, for the time, a modern, up-to-date Latin grammar. Now, one of the things that Lorenzo Valla was known for was his declamation on the Donation of Constantine, written in 1440. Now, the Donation of Constantine was a purported ancient document which gave legal evidence to the papal claim to secular authority. The popes claimed to have a secular realm in Italy. Now, Lorenzo Valla, it was purportedly the Donation of Constantine was purportedly written by Constantine himself, and it gave the impression that Constantine had donated a tract of land to the Pope for him to control directly, which became the basis for papal political power. Now, the declamation demonstrated through linguistic analysis that the document purporting to give the Pope the papal estates could not have been written during the time of Constantine, and it undermined papal claims to temporal power. And you can imagine how well that was received by the papacy of its day. And it was written notably when Valla's patron, King Alfonso of Naples, was at war with Pope Eugenius IV. So it wasn't just disinterested scholarship on the part of Lorenzo Valla. He was put to the task by an enemy of the Pope. It just shows the historical and the political context in which Renaissance humanists often operated. They were scholars, but they weren't necessarily disinterested scholars. Now, the second characteristic of Renaissance humanism is a tendency towards secularism. Now, secularism is a tendency to marginalize religious faith and religious institutions within society and culture. Now, this secularism, as it emerged in the 14th and 15th centuries, was fueled by, first of all, the church scandals of the time, particularly the Western Schism, which we had talked about earlier in the semester, when there were two and at one point three different claimants to the papal throne in the West. It was also fueled by the rise of nation states, such as France, England, Spain, and others. And people became more nationally conscious and identified less exclusively with the church. This is the beginning, you might say, of the disintegration of that socio-political entity known as Christendom, which was so important in the medieval period. Now, a representative of this tendency is Niccolo Machiavelli. lived from 1469 to 1527. And his signature work, The Prince, written in 1513, is ostensibly a treatise on statecraft. It gives advice to a secular ruler on how to rule effectively his domain. What distinguishes The Prince is that it separates politics from morality and justice. Prior to this, like in the treatises of Aristotle on politics, there was always a focus upon virtue, the responsibility of a good ruler to promote virtue within the citizens and to rule justly, according to what we identify today as the natural law. Well, Machiavelli does away with all of that. He separates politics from morality and justice, eschews any notion of natural law or virtue in political life, and he argues that a ruler should only be concerned with securing his own power. Very utilitarian and very secular, very non-religious to the nth degree. And it became very popular during this period. The work The Prince. Finally, we come to the Renaissance popes as an important consideration when we look at the Renaissance. Now, the Renaissance popes are generally viewed as personifications of the corruption that had taken hold of the Catholic Church at the time. However, much of the criticism directed against them was written by propagandists hired by political enemies. Okay, the popes had political authority, rightly or wrongly. They had political authority during this time with their control of the papal estates, and so they would often find themselves at odds with other secular rulers, and propagandists hired by these secular rulers, who were themselves Catholic, at least nominally, were the ones who wrote this criticism of the popes. This criticism was also written by courtiers who had been excluded by the papal court. Now, the papal court, like any other political court, like that of a duke or a prince or a king, would be surrounded by courtiers, those who would come to court, set themselves up in residency in this court of a ruler or a prince, and curry favor with that same ruler or prince, get their patronage, get their financial support so they could do things like be scholars or artists or whatnot. Now, sometimes a courtier would fall out of favor with a ruler and they'd be excluded from the court. Now, a lot of these excluded courtiers were the ones who wrote this propaganda against Renaissance popes. And thirdly, much of the criticism of the Renaissance popes was written later by Protestant preachers who had a polemical and theological axe to grind with the church. So, were the Renaissance popes corrupt? Well, there was certain corruption there. They were human. They had human failings. But we need, and I'm not saying that what's attributed to them are lies necessarily, but we have to consider what was written about them in their context, within the political, socio-political, and religious context in which they emerged. A lot of this is, in fact, anti-papal propaganda. So it needs to be taken with something of a grain of salt. Now, having said that, let's go ahead and turn to some of the Renaissance popes. First, we come to Pope Callistus III, reigned from 1455 to 1458, a relatively brief pontificate. He came from the powerful Borgia family in Spain, and his corruption was seen in what's known as nepotism. That is, elevating your relatives to positions of power. He elevated two of his nephews to the College of Cardinals. On the positive side, he revisited the conviction and condemnation of Joan of Arc and overturned it, which became one of the necessary steps in her eventually being declared a saint of the church. So it wasn't all bad, certainly. He did have some sense of justice. Now we come to Pius II, lived from 1458 to 1464. He was a literary humanist more than he was a man of the church, and made a poet laureate by Emperor Frederick III. Not a bad man, but certainly not a pastoral pope, which is what the church actually needs, always needs, a pope that is pastoral. Next, we come to Alexander VI, and he's probably the most infamous of the Renaissance popes, or one of the most infamous. Reigned from 1492 to 1503. He was a member of the powerful Borgia family in Spain and was accused by his enemies again of having won the papal election through bribery. He had a mistress and fathered illegitimate children, so certainly not a very holy man. But he was also a gifted administrator and balanced the Vatican's treasury. So again, he didn't do all bad, but he was, by and large, a scandalous pope by most accounts. Next, we come to Pope Julius II, reigned from 1503 to 1513. He's been referred to as the warrior pope because he often would lead the troops of the papal estates into battle against other princes. He too fathered illegitimate children and was the object of Erasmus of Rotterdam's mockery, Julius Exclusus, a short a satire or parody criticizing the Pope written after Julius's death. And it's a dialogue between Pope Julius after his death and St. Peter at the gates of heaven. And Julius is excluded by St. Peter even though he's the Pope. At the same time, Julius II took steps to abolish simony, that is the buying and selling of ecclesiastical offices. So he cracked down on some corruption, and he established bishoprics in the New World, in North America and South America, which aided the church in her evangelistic mission. So again, scandalous yet a man of many flaws, but not entirely bad. Now, the Renaissance popes were not living in the depths of debauchery, as is often presented by their enemies and by Protestant preachers of the day. Nevertheless, it is clear that for the most part, the church lacked the pastoral leadership it sorely needed at this time, which fed into what later became the Protestant Reformation or Protestant Revolution, however you want to phrase it.